Some things just go together like peanut butter and jelly, chocolate and peanut butter, and well, you get the point. Besides my evident love of peanut butter, this is also the case for horror movies and heavy metal. The 80s would see hard rock and metal have a massive renaissance thanks to MTV and the glory that was Headbangers Ball and music videos in general. With the rise of horror films and VHS, as well as cable, it would only stand to reason that the genres that were a haven for weirdos like myself would come together in glorious and gory ways. In the middle of the decade, we would see some of the monsters of rock crossing over and meeting the monsters of horror quite often, and it was a match made in hell for fans of both the music and the movies. On this episode of 80s Horror Memories, get ready to throw up the horns as we remember some killer tunes, and just plain killers, with the metal maniacs and movie monsters. Rock and roll and horror have a history that goes back quite a while, but for the sake of time, we'll give you just a few examples. Black Sabbath, for instance, took their name from a Mario Bava movie, which starred Boris Karloff. Member Ozzy Osbourne would go on to mix horror, and sometimes unintentionally real blood and bats, into his rock persona and music. Personally though, I would say my first taste of horror and rock would be a band called Kiss. Kiss meshed together dark images, personas, and amazing theater into their performances. Kiss's founding father, Gene Simmons, was also a big horror movie fan himself, and originally his persona was called The Vampire, which makes all the blood spewing make a bit of sense now, but it would eventually turn into The Demon. We'll talk more about Gene Simmons later, but like I said, Kiss would pop up late at night with Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park and on the Midnight Special, so I was hooked. Fast forward a few years to the mid-80s, and heavy metal and hair metal were on the rise, as were horror films, and the fans of both had a lot of crossover. During the decade, both would come under fire from conservative religions and government for their content, and supposed corruption of youth. The satanic panic was in full fury, and the souls of fans were the concern of a lot of people who had way too much time on their hands. Horror fans and metalheads are two groups who get a lot of flack for how they dress, what they love, and typically are seen as the weirdos, which we are the weirdos. But we're not the ones you should be scared of. Horror nerds and metal fans tend to be some of the nicest folks around, but also tend to be the most ostracized in film, TV, and real life. So the crossover appeal for these two outlets made a lot of sense, and would also hit a peak in the 80s. The middle of the decade would see a band called Twisted Sister hit the airwaves loud and proud in their makeup and leather and fight against authority. Dee Snider, another horror nerd, would lead his band into the homes of teenagers and their terrified parents. He'd also lead a charge against the PMRC in 1985, which would lead to the Senate taking on censorship, alongside icons like Frank Zappa and John Denver. If you ever meet Dee Snider, and I recommend it, he's a very cool guy, you should thank him for defending your right to listen to what you want to. That same year, Twisted Sister would release Come Out and Play, which was inspired by the line from The Warriors. That record would feature Be Cruel to Your School, a song including Alice Cooper. The whole record is fantastic, but this song in particular is one that should be of interest to horror fans because of the amazing music video. Like many Twisted Sister videos, it entails people turning into the band. Here, it's Bobcat Goldthwait as a harried teacher who turns into Snider, but his co-teacher is special effects legend Tom Savini, who turns into Alice Cooper. The entire video then turns into a zombie fest of gore and rock, with the undead denizens of the school all designed by Savini. It's glorious and gory, and I loved it. A few years before rocker Rob Zombie got behind the director's chair for feature films, Snider wrote and starred in the creepy flick Strangeland in 1998. 1986, though, would be a massive year for horror and metal. Some might say it was the year for fans of these two genres to come together. Demons 2 would be released in theaters, which is fitting as it's directed by Lamberto Bava, father of Mario, the man whose film would inspire Black Sabbath's name. Also fitting is the unbelievable soundtrack for the movie, which is nearly as important as the effects in it. This included The Cult, The Smiths, and Love and Rockets. While not as awesome as the first film, Demons 2 features a scene that scared the living hell out of me as a kid. I can still remember that demon's face as he walked out of the TV in the girl's apartment, and years later, after forgetting about this sequel, I had to relive that moment while sitting in the theater for The Ring when Samara crawled out of the TV. So thanks for that. Stephen King would direct his first feature film in 1986 with Maximum Overdrive. While King credits some, substances to contributing to the crazy ride of the film, he most assuredly credits the mind-blowing music for the movie to his favorite band of all time. When Stephen King asks you to make the entire soundtrack to his film, you say yes. And so, AC/DC said yes. AC/DC's record, Who Made Who, was also released as the soundtrack to Maximum Overdrive, and it is glorious and wails as loud as the engine on the Green Goblin truck. It added a whole other level to the movie, and the band wound up with some massive hits from the release. I mentioned Alice Cooper earlier, and I wanted to take a minute to talk about the man, the myth, and the legend. Personal story, I nearly died going to an Alice Cooper concert when some dipwad decided to T-bone the car that I was in. The group that I was with decided to still try to make the concert, even though one of us had a concussion. We missed all of Alice nearly, only catching his last song. But such is my love for Alice Cooper. Alice Cooper decided back when he started his reign as a rock and roll god that rock music had plenty of hero types and good guys, but what it didn't have was a villain. Cooper was a massive horror movie nerd, and that helped feed his incredible stage shows and persona. In the 70s, he'd even get Vincent Price to be part of his TV special The Nightmare. In the 80s, Cooper took his love of horror and crossover to a whole nother level. In 1986 specifically, Alice Cooper became part of one of horror's biggest franchises when he would sing and star in the music video for the song He's Back, the man behind the mask for Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. The song is killer, pun intended. The music video is also fantastic and pure 80s awesomeness, intercutting a lot of scenes from the film. Alice terrorizes a couple of moviegoers while also being terrorized by Jason. It may or may not have a bit to do with why Part 6 is one of my favorite Friday the 13th films. That and Tom Matthews rules, but I digress. Cooper would later, in the following decade, become part of another legendary horror franchise as Freddy Krueger's father in Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare. But we will get to the better Nightmare outing in a minute. But that didn't mean Cooper didn't have his own horror movies to star in. In fact, in the mid-80s, he'd appear in 2 of them. Prince of Darkness would be released in 1987 as part of John Carpenter's Apocalypse trilogy of films. Cooper's role in the movie is fairly silent but very creepy.
It's a really fun, simple, intellectual, gritty horror movie that of course has Alice Cooper and somebody getting green devil piss in the mouth and turning into a zombie.
But in 1986, he'd be the star of his own film, in a role rather perfect for him as a rock and roll star named Vincent Raven, who goes back to his childhood home to film a music video and instead run into a werewolf. The movie is called Monster Dog, a Spanish production that was released on VHS that year. Cooper specifically wanted to do a low-budget horror flick, and he got his wish with this one. He also performed 2 songs for the movie, with the music videos within the film being one of the highlights. The titles were Identity Crisis and See Me in the Mirror. However, the 2 songs actually wouldn't be available on any release until 1999. Monster Dog is interesting. It's worth it just for the weird factor of Alice Cooper basically playing himself and the bad dubbing that is all over the film. The filmmakers were inspired by American Werewolf in London and The Howling. But I personally love the fact that Cooper chose it because he wanted something down and dirty and sleazy if he was going to do a horror film. That's my Alice Cooper. Speaking of A Nightmare on Elm Street, we have to mention the glory that was Dream Warriors when it hit in 1987. Dokken took on Freddy Krueger and scared the Dream Demon as they wailed loud and proud about how they didn't want to dream no mo. Nightmare on Elm Street 3 is a favorite of many Elm Street fans, but this song has a special place in our hearts because it's just so damn cool to not only have Jason, but Freddy showing up on MTV like that. Let's head back to 1986 again though, because I want to give some love to what is probably the pinnacle of metal and monsters coming together. Trick or Treat came at the perfect time, with the Satanic Panic in full swing, and the myth of satanic passages being hidden within records if you played them backward. Trust me, this was a thing that a lot of us tried when we heard it, because we really wanted to know how hard the devil rocked. I have already briefly spoken about this one in a previous memory, but how can I not talk about metal and horror without mentioning Trick or Treat? Like I said before, the movie absolutely rules. The movie tells the story of metal god Sammy Kerr, who, after dying in a fire, is brought back to life as an avenging demonic ghost after his fan Eddie plays his last record backward. Eddie has to now stop the evil entity that was once his hero before he kills his fans and the people Eddie cares about. The late Tony Fields played Sammy Kerr. Fields also appeared in the Michael Jackson Thriller video a few years earlier. Mark Price of Family Ties fame was Eddie. Gene Simmons, I told you we'd be talking about him again, was the rock DJ Nook, and Ozzy Osbourne cameos as the Reverend Gilstrom. It turns out that Simmons was actually offered the role of Sammy Kerr, but didn't take it. Instead, he took on the role of the DJ, because he was a fan of the legendary Wolfman Jack, one of the greatest DJs of all time, no lie. Kevin Yeager created the special effects for the film, including the burned look of Sammy Kerr, something he would later do again with his work on the Nightmare on Elm Street films. I wore out my cassette of the soundtrack to this movie when it came out. The music was performed by the band Fastway, and it was just their 4th record. I loved everything about this movie, and I also loved the music. It rocked hard. But sadly, when Trick or Treat and Sammy Kerr came out, they didn't hit as hard as some of the other horror icons at the time. In fact, the movie was forgotten for quite a while. Eventually, some other fans and I were able to find it on a bare bones DVD released back in 2002. Since then, there has been a very limited Blu-ray release in 2014, but that is literally it for fans to be able to see it now. A couple of years ago though, something started happening. Sammy Kerr was getting a bit of attention thanks to fans who remembered the music and the monster, and Fright Rags releasing a line of Trick or Treat shirts and goodies. In fact, Trick or Treat would pair perfectly with the 1988 monster flick, Black Roses. You didn't think we'd get this one, did you? Black Roses, much like Trick or Treat, was a skewering of the satanic panic induced by the concerned religious right in the 80s against heavy metal. It seemed odd when the popular band Black Roses comes to a small town for an extended stay, until you realize the band is made up of demons who create chaos, death, and destruction via their now possessed fans. Black Roses, the fake demonic band of the same name in the movie, actually had 4 songs they recorded in the film and on the soundtrack. The rest of the soundtrack included the bands Bang Tango, Lizzie Borden, and King Cobra, to name a few. Joe Bob Briggs and The Last Drive-In helped introduce some new fans to this flick recently during their Heartbreak Trailer Park Valentine's Day special last year. This would also include the glorious Stick Shift Drive-In love song and music video, because Joe Bob also rocks hard. And there you have it, my fellow metal monster heads, a walk back through the record stacks of the 80s, when slashers and guitar smashers came together for some killer tunes. I'm still sporting my black concert t-shirts with pride, and somehow still fit in them. As a matter of fact, even though they're from my high school days. Horror nerds could always find a kindred soul in their metal-loving brethren, and sometimes they'd sell that same soul if they meant they could get some great front row seats. Keep slashing and thrashing, kids.
On the next episode, we show you a horrific view of the devious secrets hidden behind the suburban white picket fences with blue velvet. Until next time, gorehounds.
Like me.
Hi, friends, your humble narrator Tyler Nichols here, and I hope that you enjoyed that episode of 80s Horror Memories. If you missed our previous episode, click over here. If you want to see more from our series, click up here. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Subscribe right here. And most importantly, stay spooky, folks.